Thank you, Brett, for joining us today. I've spent the last few days watching your previous interviews, watching your talks, and so one thing I learned was that you were probably selling fintech before there was fintech.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think probably, if I look at it historically, 2012 was probably the year where we started using the term fintech broadly. So yeah, I was working on it like 2008, 2009.
right, right. But you were in the financial services industry even before that, right?
Yes. So I worked with HSBC,
Mm.
and other major brands, Citibank, Amex, Standard Chartered, and so forth, all through the dot-com era, on internet strategy. Then, like for example, I ran the very first usability tests that HSBC had ever done globally.
Wow.
We did the first interaction design sessions with HSBC. I wasn't an employee, but I was a regular feature set of the HSBC digital operations, both in Hong Kong and more globally. And
Yeah.
then 2007, I did the .com strategy for Standard Chartered, working with their team. And so, really, I've been, I used to run these multi-channel audits where we would go in. This is around 2005, 2006. We would go in and audit all of the different channels.
Yeah.
So your branch, your ATM, your call center, the internet and so forth, and look for ways to optimize engagement across those channels. So, it's very early, advanced
Exciting.
stuff in the digital space for sure.
Yeah, and in one talk you were talking about, and I've, been engaged with banks in different forms and shapes. There's the board, and there's the CEO, and
Right.
there's the digital team, or the
Yeah.
head of digital. And it used to be in a way irrelevant. If you were in that category, you were not really in core banking, which meant that your
Right.
career was not, you're never going to be the CEO, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then we're talking about Ant Pay or Ant Financial, where the entire team is tech. So how
Yeah.
do you see this transition in the last 20 years, from 2003 to, let's say, 2023?
So when I started in the space, at best we, like the head of digital at HSBC, at the time, at least on a regional basis, was called the head of e-services, right?
Right.
And so the head of e-services reported somewhere under the retail banking,
Right.
probably under the IT function,
Mm.
reported with a dotted line to the head of IT or something, right? Then you started to get the web
Mm.
guys,
Mm.
and from the web we get head of mobile and head of internet banking. We started to get a little bit more definition. Then you might have head of digital for a bank,
Mm.
right? And the head of
Right.
digital again reported to the CTO or
Yeah.
to the head of retail. Now we have the chief digital officer,
Right.
who's emerging. So, throughout the last 10, 15 years, we've been seeing the expertise creep into more senior roles in the bank.
Right.
But to your point, if you look at the end game for this, the end game is that the CEO must be technology capable,
Yeah.
and at the same time, you must have an entire board and an entire executive committee that is technologically sound.
Yeah.
Because the DNA of the business is no longer a bank. The DNA is a technology company that does banking. That's really the
Yeah.
change we're seeing now. So I've always said, we'll get there when a major bank somewhere around the world says, and our new CEO is, this person, and he started in the data with the bank, or he started as a programmer in the
Yeah.
bank, and now he's leading the bank. That's, I think, when we'll know, this sort of transition is complete.
So tell me one thing, that we've seen the transition in the publishing industry, and how Google and Facebook took over the ad revenue from them, and now they were in the business of distributing information, and then Google and Facebook took over that responsibility along with everybody else in digital. And we saw that ad revenues totally transitioned from newspapers and other mediums to
Right.
digital, and also got concentrated into Google and Facebook. Is that something similar we can do? And the financial services industry is obviously much larger, probably 10 or 20 times or 30 times larger than the publishing industry and the ad industry. So if that sort of things happen, so are we going to see a future in which HSBC and Citibank would be like New York Times now, versus Google and Facebook? And there'll be some digital entity which is or multiple entities which are
Yeah,
much bigger.
well, I think that's already happening.
Yeah.
If you look at the ecosystem today, the all of the fastest growing financial institutions in the world are digital, right?
Yeah.
So they're grabbing market share. So if you sort of play that out naturally, then what you have just in a few years, you have really sort of a mix between fintechs with specialization, tech giants who are playing in the financial services space with wallets and so forth, and the remaining banks and payments companies and credit companies, and so that's the ecosystem that delivers the utility of banking today. Right. And, from a consumer perspective, if you look at, say, the Chinese market, which is the most advanced fintech market, a lot of that started happening years ago. So, you have Ant Group, that you mentioned earlier that I refer to in the book. Ant Group, has 1.7 billion customers in 150 countries. They had the largest, most successful deposit pool on the planet back in 2018 with Yui Bao, which was a savings feature in Alipay's mobile wallet. You have the largest challenger bank in the world out of China in Shenzhen called WeBank. Completely digital only, play. 350 million customers in 8 years they've acquired. You couldn't do that with a conventional bank. It's starting to happen in other markets. You've got in LATAM, Nubank, which for a time was the largest bank in Latin America in terms of valuation, but today is the largest bank in Latin America by number of customers, over 65 million customers across LATAM. And that's a bank that was only started 8 years ago. So this makeup, as you say, the primary players is no longer just the incumbents, just like the ad agency. You've got these new digital entrants coming in, taking market share. Now, you've got in some cases consolidation of the industry where you have, banks buying fintechs, but you also have fintechs buying banks. So you have Gojek in Indonesia, as an example. Describing is definitely happening to the banking industry. The utility of banking can be delivered by technology companies these days in very much, in very much the way we expected banks to behave.
Yeah. So just imagining 10 years forward, 2033, can we imagine a world in which Wise and Neobank and N26 and Revolut and other entities that will come up, will they be bigger than JP Morgan and Citibank and HSBC, or will we still have, or will regulatory environment keep them, hold them back? I don't, what's your opinion on this?
So it hasn't so far. It hasn't really kept them back. I mean, here's the thing, what we've learned over this process, if you look at China, who was more progressive in terms of regulation early on, they really let these fintechs grow and become hugely influential in the market. Then they stepped in and put some controls, such as currency control or, deposit controls on Yui Bao, because they'd just grown too big and was fairly risky. And we saw what happened with Jack Ma when he criticized the traditional plays and so forth. But so there has been more regulation creep in there. Having said that, their initial regulatory approach in terms of, letting the market experiment and so forth has created much more aggressive competition in China around financial services than, say, in the United States. And the US resisted what the rest of the West has done, which is put in place fintech charters or a special class of banking license for fintech companies. And they resisted that. And so as a result, the US is not really leading this arena when it comes to challenger banks. So that sort of tells us that the more regulation that's put on to restrict fintechs, it slows down the growth of the market in terms of innovation. So if you have a bias towards the incumbent industries like you do in the US, then this is hurting them in terms of sort of net innovations in the banking and payment space now. So I think that strategically is a poor decision for the United States, because you can no longer call the US the most advanced banking economy in the world, especially when China is 10 years ahead of them in respect to mobile payments and the like. So I think that while the banks might like to think that regulators may slow down the march of fintechs, I think on a global basis,
Yes.
by 2033, that of the top 20, banks or financial institutions in the world, at least half of them will be pure tech, right?
Wow.
So that, from a valuation perspective, I would say probably, Ant was on track to be the largest financial
Yeah.
institution in the world. Now they're breaking up Ant, but I think if you were to take the collective components of Ant, in the 2030s, then as an entity, they probably still would be more valuable than JP Morgan Chase. Now, some of the Chinese banks may get there, because it's been a very competitive environment in China, and the banks have learned a lot from these new entrants into the market. But again, there's a cultural issue with Chinese banks coming offshore, even though today, the top 5 of the top 10 banks in the world are Chinese banks today. There's a question as to whether a Facebook of banking or a Netflix of banking, in digital terms, could sort of exceed even the largest Chinese banks, just in terms of reach and activity.
So compare it for me a little bit, Europe versus US. How is the regulatory environment from a startup perspective? What should they do? What are the opportunities, and what should they be looking at?
Europe's done pretty well, particularly, when I talk about continental Europe, I'm including the UK, despite the fact that they're Brexited out. But the UK obviously has attracted more talent into the UK ecosystem for fintech than pretty much any other major economy in the world, even in Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley, which is what we call New York from a startup perspective. So the UK has done quite well. The fintech, you've got Revolut, which is one of the largest challenger banks in the world. And despite their challenges in terms of regulation and so forth, Revolut still has close to 30 million customers now. So, numerically, they're a force to be reckoned with, and they don't seem to be having trouble raising money. Profitability is not something concerning, venture investors as yet, because they see them grabbing market share. Europe has done, I think, fairly well. You got TransferWise, which is now about as big as Western Union in terms of cross-border stuff. So you've got some good players that come out there. Of course, you do have Stripe, and you do have some other infrastructure players. You have the Block and Square Cash and other Venmo and other platforms in the US. But I don't think if you look at the way it's proceeding, that ability to have a fintech charter is a big one, because in Europe, I can, like in the UK, I can start a bank for basically $1 million of capital adequacy. In the United States, I need 50 million, because I need to go through the traditional banking license process. So the hurdle for being able to actually produce a licensed chartered bank based on tech in the US is obviously significantly higher. And I think that's, that they can attract talent because it's the US, and they do have access to funding in the US. So, more so than in China and the rest of the West. So these are strategic advantages for the US, but your ability to take a startup idea and then take it to a point where you can get a return on your investment is much tougher in the United States, because you have to reach that scale that allows you to spend a lot more money on, sort of licensing and things like that. So that'll mean far fewer startups will get to that point of the big exits that we see, elsewhere in the world.
Interesting. And eventually, I want you to bring you to the global digital economy and how all of us are dealing with being part of one ecosystem, which currently we're not. But before that, let's talk a little bit about Africa and how the fintech ecosystem there is developing. And there are 54 countries, each with its own environment and own challenges
Right.
and multiple languages. So how is fintech evolving in Africa?
Well, it's starting to evolve very quickly. The pandemic saw
Yeah.
a rush of investment into fintech across Africa. Globally, we saw that happen. 1 in 5 venture capital deals, in 2020 and 2021, 2022, during that period, 1 in 5 venture capital deals globally went into fintech. But in Africa, like 60% of tech investments were made in fintech. So, and you've got some very big players there, Flutterwave, obviously M-Pesa, MTN Money, and others, OPay and others making some good traction. This is not just limited to developed markets. In fact, in markets like Latin America and in ASEAN and so forth, and Africa, obviously, where you're getting financial inclusion is through these new technology plays.
Yeah.
And that's moved the needle significantly. We've had 1.4 billion people come into the financial services system through technology like mobile phones in just overall, the last decade and a bit, so decade and a half, which, we could never have done that with branches because we'd already tried for 100 years. So
Yeah.
Africa, you have sub-Saharan Africa, you have a lot of people that financially it wasn't viable for them to use the traditional form of banking, are now using mobile money and mobile wallets. And this means if you look on an aggregate basis today, more people are using a mobile wallet for their day-to-day banking than they are a formal bank account. So that's a big change, 50 by 2025, just, 2 years from now, over 50% of all commerce globally will be done through mobile wallets. Only 30% will be retained with plastic cards. So, I joke about this, but I say, African banks who are integrated into mobile wallets are further ahead than US banks who are still issuing 1970s based tech in the form of plastic cards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, sometimes it's surprising. If I'm trying to send money between EU and US, it takes longer than it's sending it to Pakistan. So
it's you can, if you a farmer in Kenya, you can send money faster to another adult in Kenya than you can in the United States.
wow.
Because in the United States you have to write a check or use ACH, and it's 3 to 5 days. In Africa, it's instant. I mean, that's crazy. The US writes, I know 3/4 of all checks written in the world are written in the United States today. They were the last economy in the world to adopt the EMV chip standard. China did $77 trillion of mobile payments throughput in 2021. The US did 300 billion. It's not even close.
Right.
If you're looking at the numbers. So Africa is one of those regions where definitely the future of banking is emerging, because you don't have to do it the way we've done it in the West. And sort of these greenfield solutions that are emerging are very different in terms of thinking, even from where we were at 10 years ago when we started doing fintech, which tended to be digitally optimized forms of banking.
Right.
Whereas you're starting to see really different types of paradigms of banking interactions and utility emerge in Africa, as an example.
Excellent. So in terms of opportunities for fintechs, do you think there is obviously cross-border, something like Wise, there is payments like Revolut, a mini bank account. What are the other opportunities? Because if you look at every business, traditional business even, there is a fintech play in every industry now, because banks have the licenses and BaaS providers
Sure.
are providing you the APIs, and now you can build up fintech layer on top of any business literally, and turn it into, and their operations are already extremely complex, and you put a small bank there, and then it really actually simplifies them as well. In terms of moving value around between their vendors, partners, employees, and so
Sure.
on. So what are your thoughts on those opportunities?
Well, Andreessen says, everyone's going to be a fintech. But, I like there are more tactical elements to it. If you look at Alibaba
Mm-hmm.
and Alipay, Alipay, for example, they do a ton of SME loans. They have this approach they call 310, 3 minutes for your first application, 1 second to apply, 1 second to approve, rather, zero humans involved, and then for your second loan, it goes down to 1 second to apply,
Mm-hmm.
1 second to approve, and
Mm-hmm.
zero humans, right? So, that's an example of the platformification of banking, coming into these platforms where we'll do business today. But it depends how futuristic you want to get, right? So if we talk about, we're expecting to see the launch of Apple's new eyeglasses or iReality or
Mm-hmm.
whatever they're gonna be called. So in 10 years' time, you can expect that smart glasses may be where we're at today with smartphones, as an example, in terms
Right.
of their broad use. That creates an entirely new app ecosystem, in terms of content delivery in a head-up
Right.
display. That creates an entirely new layer of fintech that you can build contextually. So contextual credit, for example, will replace all of our credit cards. You won't, credit card products won't make sense in 10 years' time because,
Right.
if you think about credit, it'll be contextualized. I walk into a grocery store, I don't have enough cash to buy my groceries. I'm going to get an offer on my head-up display saying, looks like you need some emergency cash for your groceries today. Here's the proposition. Instead of, oh, looks like you need a credit card. Why don't you come down the branch, sign a piece of paper? If you're not too risky, we'll send you one in a few weeks, right? That's so contextual credit is real time. You walk into a Tesla dealership, you have a car financing offer. You walk into a listed property, a real estate listed property, and you have a home financing offer. So all of the traditional businesses we're talking about, like a mortgage business, goes away because it's now contextualized data that drives that business, not someone coming and asking for home financing. And this provides opportunities for entirely new competencies and new businesses to emerge just based on smart glasses alone. Then you incorporate artificial intelligence and AI sort of coaching you and managing your finances and so forth. Now suddenly whoever has the AI becomes a gatekeeper of
Right.
offers,
Right.
because you learn to trust your AI in terms of managing your money very quickly in this scenario. And so none of that really supports the incumbents in terms
Mm-hmm.
of competency, right? Because all of the competency of banking in the 2030s will be this new competency that's emerged because of these changing tech, AI, smart glasses, et cetera.
Excellent. So one question that comes to mind is that right now, all these fintech players are generally regional. So Ant Financial is more East
Right.
Asia, China, Revolut is more Europe, Wise is also more Europe, and then other entities
Yeah,
in the
Nubank.
US and
Yeah,
Nubank
example.
in Brazil and so on. So the question comes that like the media revolution in which eventually we had a couple of companies dominating the whole world. When it came to iPhone phones, smartphones, a couple of companies dominating the whole world. Will it remain as distributed, like you have 1,000 players or 500 players around the world, or will we end up with again a couple of monopolies?
Well, I do think the operating systems have an advantage, so the players that run the OSs on the
Yeah.
smartphones, the players that will run the AIs that are embedded in, our daily operating systems, the mobile wallets that
Mm.
exist in these OSs, they will have some advantages, but a lot of it will be, if you look at what Ant's doing to prepare for this, they're sort of trying to become a wallet aggregator. So they're investing in
Mm.
all of these different wallet ecosystems to become sort of a way to parse between that. But you've also got central bank digital currencies, and you've got metaverse wallets and
Yeah.
crypto wallets coming into the space. So my belief is that you will have a cloud-based wallet, whether that's based on your smartphone OS or your smart glasses OS or just your personal AI that you have. You'll have a wallet function that links to your traditional value stores, your crypto value stores, your central bank digital currency value stores, your metaverse value stores, and sort of brings that together, right? So that's how I think the smart bank account will evolve. And, every currency we essentially use will be some sort of token or digital currency. But from a regional perspective, for wholesale trade, supply chain automation and so forth, it makes a lot more sense to have a regional play, because wholesale central bank digital currencies, as an example, will work better for cross-border interactions where existing trade partnerships are based. And so, you'll be looking at European zones of trade, Asian zones of trade, and so forth. And so I think there'll be some connective tissue there from a central bank digital currency for smart contracts. For retail, it's less clear. There'll be some global applications. There'll be some localized and some regional benefits. So you might have different flavors of that. But I don't think it will really matter in the end, because your wallet will be just smart enough to work out which is the best, pipe to use for a different type of interaction. So largely, certainly by the 2040s, we'll be giving control of a lot of our ecosystem to, algorithms. And so, increasingly, into the second half of the century, if you look at economics, more and more of our market function that we think of today will be just run on algorithms.
Wow. So I'll just be walking around and not thinking about the money, and the AI will keep deciding what I can eat and not eat.
I don't know about
Depending
eat
on
and
my
what eat. I mean, but certainly you'll be able to give your AI directions in terms of, I want to lose weight, tell me the best way to do that, and it'll coach you in terms of calorie intake and things. So yeah, there will be elements of control that are possible there. But the other thing is, we are entering a sort of this is getting very philosophical now, but we're entering a period philosophically where the value of money and markets in the way we've thought about them the last 200 years in capitalism will have to be challenged, because, we are coming, the reason, futurists and historians identify this current period as, the end of the capitalist movement is essentially, the lessons our children will have learned through this process is that capitalism really doesn't work for the benefit of all. Climate change is evidence of that. The gross inequality we see in markets like the US and the UK, Australia, emerging. This will not be seen as beneficial for humanity, particularly in an area where we require massive investment to mitigate the damage that climate has done. So you can expect that from a policy perspective, our children will have very different priorities rather than the accumulation of assets and the growth of, economies in classic GDP terms. This is going to have an effect on the way we think about debt and so forth. So there are some big philosophical changes that really have to come for humanity as a species to come through this next period of AI and climate change and so forth in a positive manner. Otherwise, if we double down on capitalism in its current form, there's a fairly strong argument to be made that this will eventually result in the extinction of the human species. So it's a pretty interesting time to be alive in that respect.
So, I grew up reading Alvin Toffler, and, he wrote like 1970, 1980, 1990, three different, time frames. And he was talking about all of this in 1970, which is amazing. And you yourself also, you're a fintech person, but you're also a futurist. So I don't mind a little bit of, delving a little bit more into the philosophy of the future. How will money and markets evolve, in the next 20, 30 years? In our lifetimes?
Well, you can see it happening right now. We had the meeting with President Xi and Putin last week. They both came out and basically said that, their goal jointly is to de-dollarize the world, is to weaken the power of the US currency. China has this whole Belt and Road infrastructure. They also have the most advanced central bank digital currency ecosystem. So if I was China, I would be insisting that all trade done with China in the future on the Belt and Road is done through the Chinese central bank digital currency. That would shift a whole portion of trade overnight, to China. So, and presumably, unless there's some major disaster economically for China, China will surpass the US as the largest economy in the world sometime in the early 2030s. They're more advanced in terms of AI regulation and integration of AI in society than the US is. Already. For every one PhD STEM graduate the US produces, China produces 8, as an example.
Wow.
So foundationally, you can see that there is sort of a change, a shift towards of more of an economic philosophy around China rather than the US. The US may use things like military blockades to try and attempt to slow China on some sort of charge, maybe their expansion into Southeast Asia and so forth in terms of military bases, whatever it might be. They're going to try and use things like that to slow down China's economic progress. But China's already made significant investments in Africa. Those long-term investments are really, I think, going to pay off significantly for China in the 2030s. The real question is, what happens with the world, when we're dealing with the climate stuff, and how does that change the way we work together? So again, the way we think about markets in conventional terms, it's pretty hard to come up with a business case for the trillions of dollars we're going to have to spend on climate mitigation, other than it's going to save 1 billion lives, right? And in classic US economic terms, there's no real value in the markets solving that problem. So you have to get more socialist by nature, not Marxist socialism, but I think the type of, we call it techno-socialism in our recent book, is where you're now starting to reprioritize the world's economy as a whole. And definitely on a national basis, you're prioritizing the economy around the needs of citizens rather than corporations. So that weakens the market's role and significance over time. And it's really the only way, you can deal with climate change the way it is. Otherwise, you have to basically write off, the estimates vary between 500 million and 1.6 billion eco-refugees. People displaced by sea level rise, food scarcity, and all of that during climate. So ultimately, this is the decision point, the fork in the road, is do we continue to marry ourselves to this concept of the market and GDP growth and so forth, which heavily relies on these austerity measures and less investment in public infrastructure and so forth, versus a sort of a monumental shift in saying, it hasn't worked, and let's now, re-gear the economies towards the needs of individuals. Now, when AI starts coming in and disrupting employment, then you've got an added element here, because, we've had 200 years of, Adam Smith, or 300 years closer to, of Adam Smith, and supply and demand economics. And now, the classic element of when demand for a product increases, you generate more human labor or human capital into the economy to satisfy that demand. That's no longer the case. Now it's just processing cycles. So sort of that fundamental law of supply and demand and the role of human capital is broken by AI. And at that point, how do you distribute wealth in an economy where the only way, the mechanism you have for it today is paying people a wage? Well, then you have to come up with something like universal basic income. But that sort of creates a permanent stratification between this, basic income people and the people who own the assets and wealth and AI and so forth. So that's not really a solution either. So we need to come up with, I think, markets that are focused on creating prosperous humanity, and sustainable prosperous humanity. And this requires a very different view of capital and the way it's deployed and resources and governance and so forth. So it could go either way, frankly. When you talk to futurists around the world and sci-fi authors and so forth, they all sort of say it's about a 50-50 chance, that we will wake up and, take the next step as a human species versus doubling down on, control through money, essentially,
So tell me a little bit more about techno-socialism and your views on that. How it's going to play out?
Well, so we talked about 4 different scenarios we mapped in the book. And this is a way we tried to think of organizing principles around human society. And this is from historical references as well as sort of thinking about models for the future. So we used basically a quadrant, four quadrant map, and the axes were either chaotic futures or planned futures. So chaotic futures where we just didn't do enough planning and it just sort of evolves that way versus where we have much more planning oriented, and then inclusive versus exclusionary outcomes. So inclusive, more democratic socialist like European markets, exclusionary, more like, the US, and pure capitalism. And so we came up with 4 quadrants. The first is the Ladistan scenario, where we ban AI or try to slow AI down because of its impact on jobs and the economy. Right? Because we recognize it's a game changer. It's not going to be fair for everybody. So we try and slow down the impact of AI. It only works for so long. We have the Faildistan, which is the chaotic exclusionary model, where, we try to keep all of the incumbents happy and so forth from a legal perspective. This is where we get the conflict between fossil fuel companies and, real response to climate change as an example. And this results in the collapse of major economies because we just waited too long to act. And then on the planned side, you have the exclusionary model, which is neo-feudalism. So this is like capitalism 2.0, very much the US system that we see emerging, where, it's survival of the fittest and use of tech to benefit only a very small class, people. So longevity treatments, for example, only accessible to the richest people. And then you have the techno-socialist view, which is an inclusive planned future where you say, we're going to use technology to radically reduce the cost of government. So it's more economically sound, but in doing so, we're also going to produce broader benefits to society as a whole. So we can eliminate homelessness, we can provide better healthcare across the nation, we have free ubiquitous education access. But this requires you breaking the back of, oligopolies and existing market control mechanisms. And that's pretty hard to do. It is what we believe is the outcome for humanity as a species, but it requires you essentially challenging the existing philosophy around capitalism and markets, So it's a tough one.
But looking at what you're describing, I would say that China is probably closer to the techno-socialist
Correct.
direction.
Absolutely. And so if this is really Chinese philosophy versus US philosophy in many ways, in terms of economic thinking and in terms of politics, I'm not saying the Chinese political model is superior, far from it, but it is simpler in terms of getting consensus and moving forward with large-scale changes in society. You don't have to get the left versus right, to meet consensus, which is, like the US is becoming tougher and tougher because there's more polarization. You can just move forward with a strategy. That in itself gives China an economic efficiency in terms of using new technologies like AI that the US can't dream of, and in terms of infrastructure, as an example. But the cost of that is sort of an autocratic system in deciding, where investment goes. Now, China knows that if it screws this up, that then they lose their political power. So you can see that was also motivated them to become much more socially oriented in terms of policy in recent years. You can even see as soon as protests started on the COVID lockdowns, for example, it really was only about 3 or 4 weeks before you see a real turnaround in terms of policy there, from a zero tolerance to, opening up the market very quickly, because the government recognizes, that they have to be responsive to this. When you look at pollution in Beijing and what they've done over the years, the attack they've made on the tech billionaires for not, for this concentration of wealth, you can see that they are well aware of the fact that they need to be very socially responsive to ensure longevity of their system of politics.
So, what's funny is that if you were to tell me 30 years ago that we'd be having this conversation in which a two-party democratic system with more freedom of speech, supposedly, is less responsive to people, and a one-party dictatorship is more responsive to people, we probably would have laughed about it, but it's happening.
But this is where the opportunity really is to sort of create a government DAO, right? A decentralized autonomous organization where government essentially is run in real time based on, some core standard of ethics, some ethical guide rails, but at the same time, a very responsive system that looks at, needs of the economy. So when we talk about techno-socialism versus Marxist socialism, that's the real difference here. Marx was talking about, the people owning the means of production, where we're saying that actually, in techno-socialism world, you have all this incredible wealth created by AI and so forth, and that as a priority, that's directed to the community as a benefit first and foremost. So the citizens own the economy is what we think of it as techno-socialism. So that you prioritize the economy based on the needs of citizens and the planet and humans as a whole over market stakeholders, right? And that's what we think sort of has to happen, for the next evolution of humanity philosophically. But it's tough when, like particularly capitalism is like a religion in the United States,
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking at a parallel, when industrialization happened and, we created more stronger borders and people couldn't cross over, and then you had some countries, taking resources from other countries to produce more stuff and sell it to the, same countries that they took the raw materials from, and, controlling the economic system in the process as well. So in a way, you had, while there was difference between classes within the US, but the difference between classes in the US as a whole versus, Sudan or, I don't know, Nigeria and other countries was much bigger, because the system was designed in a way that would, support some countries and not allow other countries to progress as fast. I mean, they had internal issues as well, but so in this new imaginary techno-socialist world, how would we address, global differences, cross-border differences between, opportunities in different countries?
Wow. Yeah, that's a complex one. It's a mixed bag. I mean, if we look at energy efficiency, for example, if we crack energy storage, which I think we will, then, renewables deployed in African continents and so forth is the next infrastructure in terms of, energy, and they could have more robust, evolving energy systems over the next 20 years than say, the US or, where we see the Texas grid failing and the Californian grid failing and so forth now, on multiple occasions. So there's a greenfield element to being able to accelerate your economy's growth and ability. And a lot of that comes to next generation infrastructure investment and so forth, which again is why China, that China's invested $8 trillion in the Belt and Road thus far, and trying to get a $2 trillion spending package in the US was contentious as an example. So, you've got part of it is based on next generation infrastructure. You've also got a shift in to knowledge and information intensive economies, so less reliance on production. But then at the same time, you've got this shift away from outsourcing and offshoring to onshoring, because automation will allow you to do that. So the US could become a manufacturing hub again, but based on robotics, not on factory workers, per se. So it's it's hard to know, what the competencies that will really differentiate, mid 21st century economies will be like, except that we do know that intelligence or smart operation of the economy is going to be probably the primary element. So the amount of AI deployed in terms of day-to-day infrastructure, so robotics, AI algorithms, resource allocation, so forth, that the sort of smart economies are going to be those that differentiate. This requires a few things to happen. First, you have to invest broadly in technology infrastructure and be prepared to sort of rip up your existing infrastructure for new stuff. So, you're taking traffic cops off the street and now putting cameras in to manage traffic management and issue fines and so forth. Sanitation, water management, lab-grown foods for food self-reliance and things like that. You're talking about some fairly significant changes, energy infrastructure, autonomous transportation, and so forth. So this is how you differentiate as a smart economy in the world of the 2050s. This doesn't necessarily, the competencies you learned during the Industrial Revolution as an economy doesn't necessarily help you, but at the same time, the end of oil will be sort of chaotic and very expensive for the world. We won't be fully developed on these alternative systems, so we'll still have to rely on fossil fuels, but there's going to be lower investment in fossil fuels, so they'll by nature become a lot more expensive. So it's not a clean transition. The next 20 to 30 years are fairly messy in that transition. But the economies that really stand out in the 2050s will be highly autonomous economies. They'll be using AI to be much more efficient.
So, the expectation from AI turning us into a prosperous world is very low. And I'll tell you why, because, even now we have enough food to feed everybody. But, just because some people can't afford to have it, they don't have the money to buy the food, even though we have the food. They're going hungry day after day, night after night. And I think the same thing would just apply, could potentially apply on a larger scale with, robotics, robots producing everything as well. So it's an interesting, world we're entering. I want to talk to you a little bit about your journey with Morven. And I saw that, you've transitioned in the last 2-3 years as well. So it was the first neobank, probably, but it has evolved.
Well, it's the first mobile neo. So technically, you could go back to Egg, which was the internet only bank. You could go back to Simple and Fedor in Germany and Simple, but Fedor was web based. Simple had mobile later after they launched. They launched on internet. We were the first challenger bank in the world to launch exclusively on mobile, right? So, these days it's of course very common for a banking app to be at the center of it, but that was our claim to fame. The first app that allowed you to sign up for a debit card globally, for sure. Yeah. Right.
Excellent. So how was that journey, building Morven, and then the recent pivot as well towards embedded finance and as a technology partner to banks and fintechs?
Well, it was a fairly pragmatic decision in the end, because we had the challenger bank and we had the software company, that ran, and we were making a lot more revenue through the software business, the platform business, than we were through the bank. We were losing a couple of $1 million a year on building the bank. Okay. And we did pioneer a ton of stuff in the US, and so that benefited us, where the bank was a lab for us to experiment with new things, and that created really interesting product demand for the platform. And ultimately, we had a plan to split the bank off and do the two separate businesses, and then the pandemic hit, and we lost our funding. So we had to basically double down on the most profitable element of the business, which was the banking as a service platform, and, as you say, embedded finance and so forth. But For me personally, a lot of the stuff I've done, as a futurist, one of the criticisms you can often get in our space is that you become too theoretical, or it's fine for you to talk about all this stuff, but it's really hard to execute on it. So I do feel that actually getting in and executing on Movin gave me added credibility as a practitioner in the field, where I was able to. You can actually read like Bank 2.0. That's the red one behind here, which was my first book in 2010. And, when you read about what I envisaged in terms of the bank account of the future, you could see a lot of that influence coming through into the design of Movin in those early days. But we had a phenomenal team, that sort of, but we couldn't get funding as well. Like 2013, we had 250,000 customers on the bank and we couldn't get funding. Today, if you were a Neo with 250,000 customers, you'd be able to raise a $50 million or $80 million round, no problem, right? So timing was a little off, right?
Yeah. I think
but
that's a problem for a futurist, right? He's in the future.
Yes,
A little too fast.
Yes. You know the definition of a futurist, right?
No, tell me.
Being wrong today. Yeah.
That's great. So, are you actively involved in that business, or are you?
So I'm still on the board, but I stepped away from my executive role. It's almost a year ago now. I'd been in it for 12 years. I registered the domain for Movin Bank or Movin Bank on August the 8th, 2010. So that tells you how long I've been involved in the business. So 12 years in, and the team, that we're building it. I've got a lot of faith in them. I trust them. We'd worked together for many years. I was just, naturally my involvement was winding down, except for just strategic, client relationships and stuff. And I can still do that as a board member, and let the team do their thing. So, for me, it was a challenge stepping away from the business after 12 years, but it was the right time. I'm doing a bunch of, I'm doing a lot more. I'm exploring the futurist stuff a lot more. Obviously started our new podcast, The Futurist, recently, and that's now, number one in the category, and doing obviously more books and so forth. So I'm as busy as ever without moving. But as I'm still in touch with the team, on a weekly basis. But yeah.
So one last question regarding Movin before I move on to you personally. Have you considered exiting from it or partnering with some other entity? Do you have even as a board member, have you thought about how it can play out?
Yeah, we got close to an exit a couple of times. We back in 2018, actually. We got close to an exit event. It didn't quite work out for us. The numbers weren't quite right. The board was, at the time, we've had a period of recovery now from the whole pandemic thing. But, I do see, I do think there'll be an exit, in the next couple of years. I actually don't think right now would be the right time for an exit. I think we can grow fairly significantly in the next 2 or 3 years, and so improve the overall value of the exit.
Excellent. So, Brett, in your personal life, do you have a wife, children?
Yes, yeah. My wife is a futurist, actually.
Okay.
So we met. I've got 4 kids, 3 from my first marriage. They live in Australia. I just had 2 boys out. We have a place in Thailand, Katie and I. Her brand as a futurist, she's called Miss Metaverse, which she came up with in 2012. So that's how you can tell she's a futurist. And that we met through the futurist community. She was working with me, before we sort of started a relationship. And then I've got a stepdaughter. So, I've got 22, 20-year-old, 14-year-old, and an 11-year-old.
Okay, good combination. So you live in Thailand. That's your.
So 6 months a year in Thailand, and then I'm in North Carolina and Raleigh right now. I've been in New York, since 2010, but we made the decision because we're not in full time in New York, we spend most of our time in Thailand. We still need a US base, because my stepdaughter, her biological father's here, so so we still spending a good chunk of time in the US, but we made the decision for Thailand for quality of life reasons,
Yeah.
and I'm speaking all around the world, so it doesn't really matter where I'm based. I've
Yeah.
done 9 countries already this year.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to continue to travel. So I just need a good travel hub, but, the healthcare is fantastic there. You're an hour from the best beaches in the world. We've got a phenomenal place on the river in Bangkok, which we bought pre-pandemic. So, it's a lifestyle choice, really.
No, excellent. I did the same. I moved to Lisbon, lifestyle choice. I love living here. I think it's it's probably similar to Thailand, just better weather.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Brett, for being here. It was great talking to you. Anything you want to say in the end?
No, but yeah, check out the Futurist podcast if you like this sort of thinking about the future or debate about the future. Then we interview science fiction authors, futurists from all around the world on various topics. I think you'd find it very interesting. And of course, Breaking Banks is the #1 fintech podcast in the world, which we do through Provoke as well. So check that out and stay tuned. I've got 3 new books I'm working on right now, so you're going to definitely hear some more from me over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Brett, for being here, and thank you from Machinelab for spending this time with us.
No problem.